Morning, sisters and brothers. I'm Chris Bryant, the lead pastor here at Peachtree City United Methodist Church. So delighted that you've chosen to worship with us today. Don't ever take your attendance for granted. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a joy to worship with you so far. We're halfway through Lent, sisters and brothers, and I love reminding people at this point every year that Lent is not about perfection. And so if you haven't gotten started on doing anything different, now's a great time to jump in. If you got started early in Lent, again, 40 days between Ash Wednesday and Easter Sunday. Doesn't count Sundays because every Sunday is a little Easter. Very good. And so, but you know, if you didn't get started, jump in now. If you did and you messed up and you've blown it and just, you know, things have gone haywire, so what? So what? The challenge is not to have a perfect 40 days. The challenge is to deliberately increase the incline of our spiritual journey, deliberately make things harder on ourselves, just like we do in the gym, but spiritually speaking, so that we get in better heart health, better faith, that now's the time where we can challenge ourselves deliberately through doing some additional things. Maybe I invite you to read through the gospel according to Mark. That's one of the things we're doing here together. I want to invite you to do that, or tithe during this season if you don't already. Let's give 10% of your income. That's a deep challenge. Maybe you would pray the Lord's Prayer every day at noon, or just simply pray more consistently or regularly, or maybe you'd fast a meal, or maybe you would deliberately accept an invitation or reach out and invite someone else to share a meal with you once a week in order to build relationships. Maybe a dinner you wouldn't normally have with someone. Whatever it might be, you still have half of Lent to do it. Plenty of time to open yourself up for more of God. Giving up so that we'd have room for something better. That's what this theme's about. And today I want to talk to you about giving up spending money that I don't have, that we don't have. And it's an incredible opportunity for us to rid ourselves of an especially destructive practice and make room, again, for something much, much better. It's an opportunity for us to finally align our faith with how we actually practice spending money or otherwise trying to accumulate things or have experiences. Now, our scripture reading today is a bit of an odd one. But I'll just say this, it perhaps is the Bible's most famous story of buyer's remorse, okay? And I know that's maybe not the best way to categorize that, and I understand, it's a serious thing. John the Baptist is killed in this text. However, I think if you'll allow me to point out a number of things, a number of details, I think there is a way to see how our topic at hand today, you know, stopping spending money we don't have, still is appropriate for this particular passage. You know, the first thing we notice is that Herod listened to John gladly. I mean, that phraseology jumps out at me. And then you couple that with verse 26, where Herod deeply regrets the promise he had made, the promise that he makes to his daughter-in-law, so to speak, who seeks John's head on a platter on behalf of her mother. Herod is caught in that moment with deeply conflicting values. And that's where we are. That's where we can relate to the story with regard to the topic at hand. On the one hand, Herod has been drawn to John. I love that our scripture reading says that, or that we read, that Herod thought John was a godly man or a holy man, and that he thought he was a fair man. Isn't that interesting? Even though John had caused him some public embarrassment and some marital issues by talking about his marriage publicly and how John thought it was wrong. And nonetheless, Herod liked or wanted to listen to him. I wonder if Herod was as much of an enigma to John as perhaps John was to Herod. And I've also wondered, when we read a passage like this, what would have happened? What would have happened if Herod would have taken John more seriously or had been more open, more readily to John's message? If Herod would have allowed himself to act upon those spiritual nudges, those spiritual inclinations that were clearly occurring in his life. And we'll never know, of course, we'll never know. But it makes me wonder. Now, at the same time, Herod is called a fox by Jesus in Luke's account of the gospel, and it's not a compliment. All right, it's Jesus is saying what kind of a person he is. And in our passage, Herod is flaunting his wealth and his prestige through giving himself a birthday party. And I'm assuming that he's celebrating his, the thing that he likes the most in his life, himself. Okay, that's kind of my impression. And he has this balloon boast in the midst of this party, where he promises something he shouldn't. And none of this really surprises us, I don't think, with regard to kings or queens or those that have risen in power. Like the fact that they kind of get full of themselves. I mean, it doesn't happen every time, but it's not surprising in itself. But we should also realize that not only do kings and queens do this, but every one of us, we have a temptation to find our own self-image, right? Value ourself based on wealth and prestige. It might not be on a grandiose scale, such as a king or a queen, but nonetheless, we fall into the same kind of thing. And so in this story, which is admittedly an extreme version, nonetheless, we see something that can occur in our lives at any point. It's a really common, we might say, nearsighted poor decision to over-exaggerate the importance of status and wealth, and in so doing, come to regret whatever we said or did in that moment, or whatever we bought in that moment. I mean, that's the proverbial buyer's remorse, right? We get caught up in the emotion of the time, of the moment. We don't think things through. And ultimately, we let one set of values, the value of getting something we're desiring or financial prestige or whatever, right? We let that overcome a different set of values in our life. And those values have something to do with how we believe that the best, most important things in life, well, that's not stuff. It's something else, right? Those things come in conflict, and at times the first one overrides the second. And in this regard, I think it's quite easy for us to believe in Jesus and believe in Jesus sincerely, and yet at the same time, when it comes to day-to-day practices with regard to money and how we spend it and what we want, to have values very different than Jesus that ultimately lead to our decision-making. And I think the best, smartest Christians recognize this, we admit it, and we work on it. And we do so because it's not something that's a quick fix, but it's something that we have to work on throughout our lives. And it's not easy, and it's not necessarily simple. The answer may be simple, but at least in ideology, but the practice of it is not. Now, I'll also say this. When you hear a sermon or title of the sermon, giving money, spending money I don't have, it may make you think of, well, that's a sermon about never going into debt or whatever. And that's a worthy conversation. It's a worthy topic of a sermon, but that's not today's sermon. The message today is not about the financial debt, or the financial wisdom of whether or not debt is good or bad or right or wrong uses of it. This message is about our attitudes and values regarding money and how we want to use it. Because if any of you, in this example, if any of you have ever actually physically been to another place in the world that is poverty-stricken, and there's some places here in the U.S. too. I've been to those places as well. But especially when you go out of the country and you find a city that's on top of a garbage heap, literally, right? You see, man, people are broken in poverty. Like you see the brokenness that comes with poverty. It's heart-wrenching, right? But we have a brokenness here that comes in wealth. And it's not so easy for us to see. We can see that real easy. But the brokenness that comes with wealth, by living in a country like this one that has so very much to offer, much more difficult for us to see, then that's part of what our spirituality is supposed to do. Part of our faith and our spirituality is supposed to give us eyes to see what we wouldn't otherwise see. And not just so that we would make better financial decisions with regard to debt or money or purchasing, whatever, but ultimately how that relates to our relationships, how it relates to the amount of joy that we feel that we have in our life, how it relates to the stress that we're under on a day-to-day basis. Ultimately, what this message is about is asking what is really the greatest determining factor in our life with these kinds of decisions because we want it to be Jesus, right? We really do. I think we're here today in some capacity because in some manner of speaking, we want it to be Jesus, but we have to admit that oftentimes we're more like Herod. We're more caught up in the money and the prestige or what we want from those kinds of things. And ultimately that can be, or the values of that sort of thing can be the ultimate determination of our actions. I want to tell you a story, and I want you to humor me real quick. I'm a history nerd. I don't think this will be too painful for those of you that can't stand history. But nonetheless, back in the 1920s of this country, there was a time of great industrial growth, a time of new industries being developed. There was the automobile industry that was taking place. There was component industries that were coming from that, like rubber and for tires and this sort of thing. That was back when the cereal was really being developed. Now, cereal had already been developed. All these things had been developed, but this is a time in the 1920s where industries were really starting to take off. Even things like ketchup or chocolate. It was not too long after this that the candy war started between Hershey's and Mars. And so it was an incredible time where a lot of people benefited by the influence of the country. And if you read history books, there's a certain designation for that decade. They call it the Roaring Twenties. That's right. Now, there's this famous, really infamous story of something that took place in 1923 at the Edgewood Beach Hotel in Chicago. There was a famous lunch of 9 men, who were among the most successful, most influential people at that time. And they had lunch to essentially talk about their wealth and like how they're going to influence the world. Now, it's not the same thing as Herod's party, but I kind of get the same vibe, okay? And let me tell you who was there. It was the president of the largest independent steel company in the United States, president of the largest utility company, president of the largest gas company, world's greatest wheat speculator, the president of the New York Stock Exchange, the secretary of the Interior under President Harding, the greatest bear on Wall Street, the bull bear, that's okay. The head of the world's greatest monopoly, and finally the president of the Bank of International Settlements. Now, that was 1923. What happens a few years later, October 24th, 1929? That's the crash, right? And the beginning of the Great Depression. You fast forward from there some 19 years, not quite 20 years. And all of these men that were at that lunch have met their demise. Charles Schwab dies bankrupt, having lived on borrowed money for 5 years before his death. Samuel Insull dies a fugitive from justice, penniless in a foreign land. Howard Hobson is considered insane. Arthur Cutton dies abroad insolvent. Richard Whitney has just been released from Sing Sing prison. Albert Fell, he was the Interior Secretary under Harding, is released from prison so he could die at home. Jesse Livermore, Ivan Kruger, and Leon Fraser all die of suicide. Now, it's a grim story, right? And you're thinking right now, what in the world has this to do with me and an impulse purchase I might make? Well, the thing about it is, it has to do with the lies that we tell ourselves. And it seems to be that we're susceptible to these lies regardless of how much money we have or don't have. And the lie is that we just need more money. Now, there's lots of times in our life where that may be empirically true. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that attitude that kind of stays with us, that just kind of assumes that life is better with more money. And again, set aside the empirical kind of thing of, obviously, you need more money to do it. That's just the way the life works. But there's something about that lie and its sibling, which is related very close to it, which is more stuff, more experiences, more things that I can get with that money is going to make me a lot happier. If I just had more money, that's right. Like just more money solves everything, and a little bit more stuff and experiences that I can buy with that money, that's going to make me a lot happier. And that's what advertisers use a lot of times as well, especially at Christmas time. You really see it at Christmas time where it's subtle, but the promise is, hey, just a little bit more, so much happier. Some of these worst lies that we contend with are built on or are half-truths themselves. Some of us, if you're like me, the majority of my adult life, 2/3 of my adult life, I had a lot less than I have today. And I've worked really hard in earning and saving and being frugal in my spending to be in a much better place. You delay gratification, this sort of thing. And, it's a wonderful thing. And some of you know, if you haven't done that, some of you know at least the value of working really hard, saving up, denying yourself in order to get something at a more appropriate time. And the joy that's there, not just the new car or whatever, but the fact that you worked hard for it, saved up for it, and got it. Or the trip that you were going to take, it ends up being a really good trip. That's great. But part of the joy of the blessing of it is it took you a while to save up to go, but you did it. I mean, these are wonderful things, right? The problem comes when we try to shortchange that, to just get to the end as quickly as possible. And once we do that, it's very addictive. And it's like we want to do it over and over and over again. Just get me there. Beyond this, there's some sense that the people who have it all, right, they don't have any problems. And the truth is, people that have more struggle just as much, if not worse. Now, we may joke about that, and I have as well. There's times where you're like, oh yeah, they have problems. Maybe I could handle their problems for like a week or two, I get it. I understand and I relate to that. But what we're failing to do is recognize that we're overestimating the joy. We're overestimating the joy, and we're deeply underestimating the struggle that it ends up being with our soul or in our relationships or peace of mind, especially when the idea is, I just want more stuff, and we take shortcuts to get there. Have you ever bought something on credit, or a lot of credit, whatever, and at first it was really good, but then the joy, it didn't last nearly as long as you thought, and you're like, ugh, right? That's that buyer's remorse, right, that we're talking about? Or, have you been with a partner or a loved one where it's just like they're always on to the next thing? The next thing. Don't raise your hands. It's the next thing. I'm just kidding. Right? But it's exhausting. It is exhausting. It's like always gotta have, something else, gotta go to the next place, gotta whatever. Have you ever been troubled by, friends or family in what they can purchase or where they can go? And you're like, man, I wish I could be them. I'm sure all of us can fit in one of those categories. But what we got to remember is, wait a minute, even when we do that, it's not enough. Even when we shortchange the deal and do things on credit or whatever, or we work, there's always more. There's always something else. There's always another trip. There's always something. It just never stops. If having more money or buying more things or being able to afford to go to more places was the answer, nobody would feel this way. Everybody would feel great after the first time. But the thing is, it never stops. At least not from us having more money. If money by itself was the answer, those guys in our story that I just read, or talked to you about rather, they would have been the ones in the best position to handle the Great Depression. But money wasn't, it's not what protected them. The other values and stuff is what they needed that they didn't have. And those other values that they had that were more about money and wealth and prestige, that all led to their destruction. They needed a different set. You know what's really interesting? Americans were more generous during the Great Depression than at any time since. Isn't that something? The national average of generosity at that time was 3.3%. And since then, it's hovered between 2.2 and 2.4. Sometimes a little bit less than 2.2, never more than 2.4. Now, this is interesting because despite how boisterous the economy has been since then, you've picked a decade. We can always talk about how bad things are, but it's the 80s, 90s, 2010s. I don't know, but at no point in time, no matter what was good in our country since the Great Depression, has giving ever been more. The national average has never come close. The generation that lived through the Great Depression learned quickly and permanently not to spend money they didn't have. And it also appears that at the same time, they learned to be the most generous of any generation since. So they learned to quickly and permanently, to not spend money they don't have. And at the same time, they learned how to be the most generous of any generation since. The question is that a coincidence? Did that just kind of happen? Or are those two things related? Is a spiritual truth coming to surface? See, it appears in our broken nature that we have this insatiable desire for more. No matter what we have, apparently it's like it's just never enough. And the spiritual antidote to that is generosity. We learn to be generous, not by our having more. That's not how you learn to be generous. Even though we say that, we say, oh, when I have more, I'll give more. That's a lie. That's not true. That's not how you learn generosity. You learn generosity by learning how to live on less now. That's generosity. That's how it works. Now, this is true independent of whatever financial state a person happens to be in, from homeless to extravagantly wealthy. Now, 10, 12 years ago, I'm not so sure I would have given that example as far as homeless. But it's been my experience in ministry firsthand and in more than one or even two situations to experience the need, even among homeless folks, the need to be generous. There's something about that helps us be human. And it helps us get into a different trajectory than the one we're on. Oftentimes, our self-destruction has to do with self-centeredness. And it's when we start thinking about others and being grateful for what we already have, whatever that looks like, that we start going in a different direction. Back in the fall, late fall, I was preaching on a sermon on generosity and contentment, and I said, you don't need more to share what you already have. You don't need more to share what you already have. And people liked it. Like, I got a lot of feedback, like, that was really good. And this is very, very similar. We don't learn to be generous by saying, if I have more, I'll have more, then I could give. No, we learn generosity by learning to have less. It doesn't work any other way. Our struggles with spending money that we don't actually have continue in different forms and shapes throughout our lives. We can wrestle with good decisions, bad decisions. Only when generosity becomes a priority, a life value, a life anchor, do we start to feel relief or some relief from this thing of spending money that we don't actually have. God works in our lives through generosity in ways that God doesn't work anywhere else. And that may seem strange to you, or maybe it even smacks of manipulation. You're like, well, this guy's a preacher in the church. I don't know, I get it. So just as I end the sermon, just think about your kids for a second, or your grandkids. How in the world do you teach them to be generous? Have you taught them to be generous? Because most time parents don't think about that till it's too late. And you experience it as an adult, as them as adults, where you see opportunities or you see things and you see the selfishness and it hurts. How are you teaching? Let me tell you something. We argue with our kids over all sorts of money issues. The difference, the change that happens when we start introducing the idea of generosity is incredible. And not just, hey, every once in a while you need to give something, man. When we start introducing this thing about our faith, this commitment, consistent commitment to giving a portion of what we have now, is when we start actually doing that, sharing that, showing that, it impacts all those financial conversations we have with our kids. It changes everything. And I know this from firsthand experience. It's something I've done. It's something I keep doing. It's something I'm working on as a parent, as my kids, my boys, and stepboys are all becoming young men, okay? Generosity really is the only thing that impacts us when it comes to our insatiable desire for more and the temptation to find the easiest, quickest way to get whatever it is that we think we need or want or whatever. Generosity has got to be more than an activity. It's got to be a state of mind and attitude that God is our provider, that we can trust God, and put our life in his hands, that every good and perfect gift comes from above, and that it all belongs to God anyway. With that, you learn to be content with what you have now, not waiting for more to be so, and to give a portion of what you already have. And when that happens, it resets something up here and in here. Otherwise, we'll find that we have faith in Jesus, we really do, but when it comes to these money matter stuff, we tend to decide on values that are unrelated to him. And that's why we have to place a bigger, more consistent emphasis on generosity. Lent's a great time to do that, to give up spending money what we don't have, and in its place, think, how can I be more generous with what I have now? Learning to have less. That's the way it connects. That's the way it works. We learn generosity not by having more, but by learning, accepting having less.